discussion. Download it all.
Where are you from?
I'm from here. I am incoming PhD student in the Florida.
Oh, wow. PhD student.
Yeah, but I'm from South Carolina. Yeah.
Okay.
And you?
I'm from Boston area, New Hampshire now, but I'm from Boston College originally. I retired supposedly. But
That's good. You can still
really
see me
retired.
if we're over here. Okay, is it 9 o'clock?
I think so.
9 o'clock, 9 o'clock happened? Okay,
Exactly.
all right. Welcome, my friends, to the final concurrent session of the conference. Thank you for choosing this one. The question is the complexities of knowledge in scare quotes in relation to nursing. So we'll be talking about that in 3 talks. We'll be hearing from Clémence Dallaire, who is going to be joining us virtually. She's up there in the top left corner. She'll be speaking here, Popper and Kuhn, how do they influence nursing science? We'll be followed by Mark Risjord, who'll be talking.
And Emily.
And Emily and Emily, and they'll be talking about Kuhn. Okay, can't wait. And then I'm going to be talking about Peirce. So I think we're in for a really good session. The way that we're going to do this, please write down your questions and hang on to them. We're just going to go ahead and get all the presentations out of the way, and that will then hopefully afford us a larger Q&A session where we can engage with all the presentations together. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor over to Clémence.
Thank you, Miriam. I'm presenting on behalf of Marie-Soleil Hardy and Nisrine Mubarak. Nisrine is online with us. So the theme of the conference this year was what has philosophy ever done for nursing? And because the 3 of us are more interested in the philosophy of science, we decided that we would focus on philosophy of science. But how could we answer that question from the perspective of the philosophy of science, which is a huge group of people? So we've decided to focus on Popper and Kuhn, which means that we're looking at some years back in nursing in a way. Why those 2? Because to look at the part of the discipline that we could call nursing science and scientific knowledge, we have to have a vision of science. And just to remind you that Steve Edwards in his book said that if we want to compare nursing or associate nursing with science, we have to have a vision of science that is not distorted, that is one that is proposed, for example, by the philosophy of science. So that's why we are looking at Popper and Kuhn, 2 great figures in the I can't seems to be able to. Okay, so we first I already situated our presentation in the theme of the conference and why we were interested in those 2. What we have done is to look at some of the books that have been published in nursing and that have the basis for the discussion about theories, knowledge, and nursing science, and to look at how much they have been referring to Popper or to Kuhn to compare their influence or lack of influence thereafter. And I will be offering a tentative conclusion. Karl Popper, just a small reminder, it's a huge figure in philosophy of science. I will not go into details, but just to remember that Popper valued theory, that everything for him, science was theory. Everything was starting from the theory and ending with theory. The other thing is that Popper proposed a vision of the world of three worlds. Kuhn was very popular in nursing. As you can see, he was a little bit younger than Popper. He lived a little bit less years in terms of number of years. And one of the things that we remember Kuhn for is I took this small image from the web, and they call it the Kuhn cycle, that science has a normal cycle with disciplinary matrices, and then because exception build up, then there is a revolution and we go to something else. And it's interesting to look at those two in the actual context of nursing and the discipline of nursing, because of the huge influence of historicism, of the sociology of science, the sociology of knowledge, how rationality in nursing is something that we pushed aside a little bit. The objectivity, scientific norms, it's something that is that we try to keep away from for good or bad reason. And knowledge, there is, I'm referring to Kim, Seizu Kim, that divide knowledge in terms of public knowledge and private knowledge. And in nursing, we embed private and public knowledge at the moment quite often. And those philosophers of science were referring to public knowledge, the knowledge that has been tested. So from a review of books, and sorry for you, Mark, but we didn't include your book in it. Because you're a philosopher and we wanted to look at nurses and nursing theories, even though I have to mention that there is a very, very good chapter on Kuhn in your book, and that you use a lot of philosopher of science, but that our main interest was to look at, if we pretend that there is an influence of those philosophers of science, what can we find in those books? So on the left, you have Steve Edwards' book, The Philosophy of Nursing, and in it, no mention of Popper, no mention of Kuhn. So he used other philosophers. Beth Rogers published this book on the philosophical tradition and influences on nursing, and no mention of Popper, no mention of Kuhn in those two. So that was quite surprising for me. Then if we move to the right, then we have the book edited by Nicole, where we can find a lot of very classic articles that were published in the 70s, beginning of the 80s. Most of them were published elsewhere, a few specifically for this one. And there is a series of those books. Nicole was involved in the first three, and then Reed took over. And as you can see, the last one that was edited by Reed and Schaefer was in 2012. And you can see the arrow that is going down in the first in 1992. So I have more specific examples. So you see all the edition of those, and Nicole mentioned in one of the nursing theory week that according to her, it was the second one that was the best one. And why did she put together that? It was mandatory readings in a graduate course. So it's what nurses were learning at the time, those who were doing graduate studies. So that's why it was interesting for us to see where is the influence of those two. So in the 1992 edition, there was 9 mention in the index of authors for Popper and 15 for Kuhn. And you can see that some of them are mentioned both philosopher of science, and some mention only one. And one of the things and in the 2012 edition, there is only 2 mention of Popper, and they were by Hardy, who was in the first one, and Reed, who it was just a mention in passing to refer to positivism and those type of received view. And then Kuhn was mentioned 9 time in the index. And we've done a reading of all the quotes, but for now, time will not allow to go in more details, but we could see that there was a decreased mention of those two philosophers. If we look now at another one, a perspective on philosophy of science in nursing, and then the philosophy of science for nursing practice that Denke and Denke published first in 2016, and then there was it was not the first edition, and then in 2021, and we see from Polyphony and Beck in 1999 an increase in the mention in the index of those philosophers, and then a decrease in the last edition. Another example of the influence of Popper, Fawcett. Fawcett is very well known. She proposed two different things, a structure of nursing knowledge and the CTE structure for research. Fawcett is referred to by a lot of, and it is taught in numerous programs, but when we check how much she's used in practice, not that much. And if we check herself, she told me that she referred to Popper, and we can see, for example, that the way she positioned the conceptual model as not being able to be empirically verifiable looks like some of the things that are said by abstract theory by Popper. She proposed also to start by conceptual models and then to elaborate middle range theory and then to test them. And among the nursing theorists who propose conceptual models, there's Roy, Newman, and King, where there is a lot of middle range theory that has been elaborated, but only Roy did synthesis a few times of what has been accomplished in terms of theory testing from her model. What we didn't find. So waiting for the hamburger, but we were waiting for the hamburger too. What we didn't find in the literature. One thing that struck us was that theory is very popular. It is like for Popper, science is theory. How are they being used in nursing, and what are we doing with it? And I'll give you an example on that with theory of comfort and transition theory. What we're doing, we're reproducing theory, but are we testing them, like Popper said? Not really. I haven't found any comparison between, for example, Koltkaba's theory of comfort and Morse's praxis theory of comfort. Neither for the transition theory. I had to do a speech on the transition theory last year, and I looked over in the literature to find analysis of the theory of transition from Melise, and I found one, and no comparison of that theory with any other type of theory. So we don't know, are we just accumulating theories, or are we focusing on an understanding of phenomenon or description of phenomenon in nursing as is proposed by Popper in his view of science? Another example in terms of progress, are we providing better explanation? On the left side, there is the symptom management model that has been refined a few times. This one is from 2001, but there is other version of it. And there is a theory of unpleasant symptoms. So what do we know from those theories, and how are we better able to provide care from those theories? If we follow Kuhn and Popper, both of them, we should be able to answer those questions, but we couldn't find any way of any answer to those types of questions. Now, in terms of progress in nursing science, Popper has an evolution type of, he proposed an evolution type of progress for theories and for organized knowledge in the science, and Kuhn proposed a revolution once exception accumulates. So if we look, for example, at Fawcett's vision, Fawcett's propose a way to do research and to test some of the conceptual model by using the middle range theory, but nothing else than that is proposed by Fawcett. So we don't know what we do once we have those theories. What do we do with them? Do we just have them and then associated them with conceptual models, or? And so neither, we couldn't find any analysis of have we made progress. To be honest, Fawcett once published an article that says that there is a hallmark of success for nursing science. And then she mentioned that there is the meta paradigm, there is a doctoral program, there is those type of things, but it's not based on either proper ways of seeing the progress in science, nor on Kuhn's way of seeing progress in science. So in those books, what we've seen is a very superficial utilization of both Popper and Kuhn. We've seen some confusion in terms of the ideas from them, and at times some misunderstanding of the position of one or the other. So in terms of influence, what can we say? So if we look at Popper in this one, the theory in science are very important. Science starts with theory, hypothesis, conjecture, all starts in theory, and those theories are put to a test. How it has been translated in nursing, we have a series of tools to do theory analysis and theory evaluation, as opposed to theory testing. So in terms of, are we learning, describing, knowing better about nursing intervention, nursing care, nursing result from those theories? At the moment, there is no published literature that will support that. Popper was all hypothesis and conjecture from existing theory. In nursing, Fawcett is the one that proposed more strongly to start with conceptual models, to start with theory, and to end with theory. But if we look at, there has been in the last decade or so, a lot of literature review that look at how much theory are being used in research, being used or taught in nursing program and all that. And it's a very low percentage. So we cannot from that infer that Popper view of science is influencing what is happening in nursing. Progress as evolution toward the best theory, I already addressed that. Truths in nursing, there is something that we try to get away from, because there is a lot of saying about truth doesn't exist. Popper agrees with that. So, but it's not from him that it is something that is dearly held in nursing. In Popper, there is rationality and critical rationalism. In nursing, what we've seen is that rationality doesn't seem to be a huge preoccupation or something that is taken into consideration a lot. We hardly see that term used. And in terms of ontology for Popper, there is these three worlds that he proposed, and that ideas and the ontology is embedded in those three words that are autonomous but interrelated. And in nursing, there is this mistaken idea that for proper values and subjectivity are totally excluded, don't belongs to any of the thing that we're doing. So that's summarized around theory, around the ontology, what has been translated into nursing. We don't see that much at the moment. For Kuhn, progress of science, Kuhn was used to justify the beginning stage of development of nursing as a science. So it was very much used in the 60s, 70s, and it was referred to as Kuhn mentioned, there is a pre-paradigmatic stage in a science, and it was really used for that, but no way forward. Then what do we do with that? Progress in science as revolution is not substantiated in any of the published articles or analyses that we've found. The other, Kuhn proposed a disciplinary matrix or paradigm, and there is a lot of confusion in nursing and at least in students and in some of the published literature between paradigm as an ontology and paradigms as a disciplinary matrix. The other thing is that in nursing, organized knowledge, exemplars of solution towards problems that we face in clinical practice are not that much organized. So that idea of a disciplinary matrix from Kuhn, we don't see a lot of that in the published literature in nursing. For example, if we have books on middle range theory, each one is a silos in a chapter. And the tool is presented in the first chapter. So how to accept theories or findings in normal science from how Kuhn saw the scientific matrix or disciplinary matrix. We don't find any evidence of that in the literature. And then there is the word meta-paradigm, that is something that is has been borrowed from Kuhn, but has been used as the object of a discipline. And it is very much contested in nursing as a term, and the idea within what has been the four concepts of nursing within the meta-paradigm is also very questioned by nursing theorists and by nursing in general. And that's not how Kuhn saw science and scientists working together. So we don't see any influence of Kuhn in that. Popper and Kuhn were not used to define science, were not used to define knowledge or organize knowledge in nursing. And Popper, what we found, and Allmark in his article in 2003, had the same perspective, that Popper was used mostly in the position of a villain in nursing. So as a tentative conclusion, the evidence of influence of Kuhn and Popper, from what we've analyzed, are a bit elusive. Some elements of their vision could be useful for nursing, for example, testing of theories and progress, trying to substantiate progress in nursing in terms of the theory produced would be something interesting. So we need synthesis. And the invitation from Popper to critique, and to that every critique is welcome, could be something that we could use in the future and could be helpful. It could be a helpful influence. So thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll go ahead and move right along. So Mark, come on down. And then maybe you could spotlight Emily so we can also see her while the presentation's going. Yeah.
Okay. Computers make everything easy. And can you spotlight Emily as a speaker?
She'll have to unpin.
Thank you.
Do you have a clicker too?
I have a correct clicker. I was just hoping you could just spotlight Emily the way you spotlighted Clémence. Because she's a speaker.
It's the box over.
I am currently spotlighted in the Zoom room.
There
There
you
you
go.
go. Now make her a little bigger so we can see her. We're gonna be ping ponging back and forth during the presentation, so it's.
There.
There we go. Yeah, that'll.
Perfect.
All right. Hey, Emily. All right. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here at IPON's the Nursing Philosophy Conference and presenting this material. I've been working, actually I've been working with two students. I'm so proud that I've got two students here presenting it with me at IPON's, or I'm presenting with them really. I just happen to be the person on the spot here, and Emily's far away. So I'm Mark Risjord, Emory University professor of philosophy associated with the nursing school, or used to be. Emily is a PhD student working on the microbiome, and this work comes out of, it started out as a kind of informal project, just exploring some work in the philosophy of science around the microbiome, and we found some really interesting stuff and are working on a paper that I thought would be fun to share. There's a rumor going around that I want to squelch right away that we wrote this paper solely so I can say the word poo. But no, that's not true. All right. Did this work this way?
Yeah, no.
Wrong thing.
Is this a is it a PDF?
Yes.
Okay, then you're gonna have to say advanced slide.
Okay.
That's what Mark, John said, but this only works for PowerPoints.
Yeah, that's correct.
So just.
Oh, no, I'm sorry, it's a PowerPoint. I misunderstood you.
Oh, then it should work.
Yeah.
Is there a reason it's not working?
Maybe it's.
Oh, there you are.
Oh, all right. Moving all over the place. All right, here we go. So we're going to frame our work in terms of the question of holism and reductionism. And holism means a lot of different things in nursing. There's been, of course, literature sorting all these things out. And I'm concerned with one particular version of idea about holism, and that's the commitment to holism that contrasts itself with reductionistic science. And what I mean by reductionism here is a scientific project that looks for micromechanisms of one sort or another. And in this Hall essay, they pose the question very well. If we can only understand human beings as sort of irreducible and unitary, then how could you possibly understand them through the study of, as they say, discrete parts of isolation? We're going to try to answer this question, or here's our answer to this question. Most of the work in our talk, all of the work in our talk, is around defending this idea that the current microbiome research is showing the microbiome has cognitive function, right? And so we're going to try and show that that might be plausible if the research keeps going the way it is. And then the rest of this spells out the connection, right? If it's got cognitive function, there's something about the whole human being that we're coming to understand that we didn't understand before. And this research is clearly reductionist, right? So we get this sort of, almost paradoxical conclusion that if you really are committed to holism, what you ought to do is reductionist research, right? If you want to understand how humans are put together in a holistic way, what you want to do is look at the micromechanisms. That's the ultimate lesson. And really, I think this work is as much an illustration of that as it is really an argument for it. So with that, we go to our scientists in the field. And Emily, tell us something about what you're seeing in the microbiome.
Just so we're all working with the same definition of the microbiome is comprised of all of the microorganisms that live on and inside of us. And this particularly means that these microbes are colonizing and persist within us. They're not the over-the-counter probiotics we take that are tourists through our gut and that we pass out pretty quickly. And our microbial cells in our microbiome actually outnumber our human cells 10 to 1. And the genetic content of those cells, or the DNA within those cells, actually outnumber human genes 100 to 1. So in many senses, we're actually more microbial than we are human, depending on how you want to look at it. And we also know that the gut microbiome is actually very essential for our health. We need our gut microbiome for our immune system to develop normally, to get nutrients out of our food, And even for some medicines to be activated, we rely on our gut microbes. And I'll hand it back to Mark.
Thanks, Ellen. Okay, so reductionism. If you're thinking about human beings from a materialist standpoint, one of the questions philosophically you have to deal with is what do we do about how to understand the mind? And in the late 20th century, a very standard view about this emerged called functionalism, where we understand mental processes as material things playing a particular kind of functional role. So what it means to be hungry is for your brain to be in a particular state caused by, very roughly, certain food deficits, right? And it's the outputs of that functional state are food-seeking behaviors, for instance, just a really simple example. So identify functional states by their causes and effects. And one of the virtues of this that people liked is that it gave us a really clean way of saying that, say, animals are minded in the same way that we're minded. They really have minds. So if you take, Descartes famously denied that animals had minds and felt pain and this kind of thing, or at least some dualists did. But on this view, yeah, if their brains go into states that are analogous to our functional states of pain, they feel pain in exactly the same sense that we do, right? So that was taken to be an advantage of this kind of view. An interesting consequence of this view was developed in the 90s. That is, functional, different brains can have be in the same functional state, right? Is there anything, different material systems can exhibit the same functional states? Is there anything really special about what goes on inside your skull, right? Can't those functional states include things that are external to your brain? And Otto's notebook is a classic kind of intuition pump about this. So the idea is, imagine a person who's maybe early stages Alzheimer's, memory is not so good. In fact, it's deteriorating, but he's good enough to be able to handle a notebook. And so when someone tells him where to go, what to do, he can write this down and he knows enough to be able to consult the notebook. So the argument is that the notebook is functioning in the same way that his memory normally functioned. It just doesn't happen to be inside of his skull. So the notebook, the physical notebook with the print on it and everything, really is part of his cognitive function. It's constitutive of his memory in this case. Now, this line of thinking has gotten picked up in some philosophical work on the microbiome, and people have gotten actually very excited about the idea that the microbiome might be thinking, right? In some sense, doing some kind of cognitive processing. And when Emily and I started working on this, we came across this work, and it was both kind of cool in the sense that that's a really interesting idea, and also kind of problematic, and that we thought that the arguments that were being made for it were way too quick. Because, for instance, Otto's notebook's a bit of a problematic example. What would make that a cognitive function as opposed to any other kind of function? So most of the work in the paper that we're working on digs into this, and the large part of the project is, or the question we're asking is, can we characterize cognitive function in a way that's satisfactory, so it distinguishes it from other kinds of functions, and then characterize that in a way that would apply to something like the microbiome, right? And then, is the science going in that direction at all, right? Is the science even pointing towards the microbiome having that kind of function? So it's a little bit of a complicated chart. I'm sorry about that. A lot of information here. Here's a couple of different functions, right? So there's a part of your brain that helps you recognize faces. That looks like a cognitive function, right? It's not really high level, but it's still part of your cognition, right? Now, there's other kinds of functions, right? So the regulation of your body temperature is another function. There's lots of functions of the body, but not all of them are cognitive. Presumably, this is not a cognitive function. And then Otto's notebook, is that a cognitive function or no? Right, so here's sort of three contrasting examples. Now here's some criteria people have brought to bear on the question of what kind of functions are cognitive and what kind aren't. First, you think a cognitive function is going to have to process information somehow, right? So if it's just another kind of causal system, it's not processing information, it's not cognitive, very minimal criterion. Arguably, all of these do, right? The hypothalamus is taking in information and using that. But now it's not the hypothalamus doesn't seem to be doing anything about representation. Something about cognition has something to do with representation. Now, representation is itself a huge philosophical can of worms. What are we going to do with that? We decided to be very minimalist about it and just say, look, if the causal system, whatever the microbiome ultimately is going to be doing, if information from it is flowing up into whatever parts of the brain are motivating you to do things or helping you reason about things, it gets into the motivational and reasoning structures of the brain, we're going to call that representation, right? And so it's a fairly generous criterion. That's what the hypothalamus is not doing, so it doesn't count as cognitive on this, though Otto's notebook still does, right? Another thing people have used, what they really used to rule out Otto's notebook, is the idea of a proper function. Now, this comes from philosophy of biology and some work in the philosophy of language by Ruth Millikan. And the idea of a proper function, as opposed to just other kinds of function, is that it's a function that comes about through evolution, right? So the proper function of my heart is to pump blood. Why is that from an evolutionary point of view? Because in ancestral populations, those that had the pre-hearts that did that sort of thing out-survived their conspecifics who didn't. And so that's the explanation for why my heart does what it does, is this historical evolutionary. So that's the proper function of my heart, as opposed to other functions my heart might have, right? I might use my heartbeat to get, a roughly 67 beats per minute time for a musical piece, right? I once had a conductor in an orchestra who did that, right? And that's a function of his heart at that moment, right? But it's not the proper function. His heart wasn't selected for over time to provide, thumb sounds at 60 beats per minute roughly, right? So this is actually a pretty high bar for the microbiome, right? So it would have to have evolved in such a way to actually process information that ultimately makes it into the motivational and reasoning parts of our brains. So I won't spend much time on this slide. This takes those three criteria and sort of makes them more precise, right? So what we're going to look for in the microbiome is the microbiome varying in some kind of reliable way with stuff in the environment? That is it picking up information? So this requires a bigger conception of information. I won't defend that, but it's a very minimal conception of information. And then this, as I said, that the causal role of the microbiome is going to make that information available to the decision-making or action processes, and that causal role is itself been selected for. So that's what it would take on our argument for the microbiome to actually have a cognitive function as opposed to any of the other biological functions that it might have. So, Emily, take us.
So here in our blue box is basically those criteria, but with all of the philosophy jargon taken out of it. And so that hopefully everybody can understand these questions. And so our first question again, is the microbiome doing some kind of information processing? And for our purposes, it's sufficient for there to be basically reliable changes in the microbiome that are correlated with some sort of external state or brain state. Second, does this information that the microbiome is processing, does it actually make it to the brain? And then once it's there, is it actually doing anything? Is it actually playing a role in decision-making or actions? And then third, is this the result of mutualistic adaptation? And that gets at that proper function. So if we hit the next slide, we might ask ourselves, why do we actually think that the microbiome is important for cognition? Like, why should we actually dive into this and invest our time and energy into evaluating these criteria? And there's a lot of really suggestive evidence that the microbiome is actually playing a very important role in cognition and mental well-being. So if we look at the microbiome of people who experience trauma, people who subsequently develop PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder have a different microbiome compared to those who experience trauma but do not develop PTSD. And so this is not to say that the microbiome is therefore causing PTSD, but there's a lot of other research that implicates the microbiome in that stress response and in regulating stress response. So maybe how strong that stress response is. We can also look at germ-free mice. And so these are mice that are completely sterile. They have no microbiome. They have never been exposed to microbes. And they are extremely weird. Everything in their body is totally different compared to typical mice. All of their organs are different sized, so their livers are much larger and their intestines are much smaller. Their brains have fewer folds, and the distribution of neuroreceptors are very different in their brain. And their behavior is also very different. And so the behaviors they display are behaviors attributed to mouse models of autism. So that would be antisocial behavior and repetitive behaviors. But so all of this is just to say that we think the microbiome is actually important in cognition. And so if we look at this slide, we're going to go through some examples on the microbiome in mental health, because I think that will be the most relevant for all of us here. In the paper that Mark and I are working on, we also go through some examples in food-seeking behaviors. But to tune into mental health, you may have heard of the gut-brain axis before. This is the bidirectional communication pathway between the microbes that live within our gut and our brain, or our central nervous system. And this figure shows the four main communication pathways along the gut-brain axis. There's this neurometabolite production, where our microbes in our gut are directly producing neuroactive metabolites. We have an endocrine response, immune activation, and the most studied of these four communication pathways is the vagus nerve. It is the 10th cranial nerve. It's in charge of things like your heartbeat and digestion, that parasympathetic activity. But it allows our gut microbes in our brain to directly send signals to one another. And so on our next slide, we'll actually start diving into some of these examples. So for example, psychological stress is known to be reliably associated with changes in the microbiome. And this can be a momentary stressor or an acute stressor, like taking a board exam, or space flight was another really cool study. But there are also consistent changes in the microbiome associated with depression and anxiety, specifically clinical depression and anxiety. So that satisfies the first criteria. Then if you take the microbiome from a person with depression and you put that microbiome into a mouse, you see that that mouse ends up displaying a lot of depressive behaviors, or mouse models of depressive behaviors. And so that satisfies that part B of the second criteria, that transferring the microbiome is actually changing behaviors. And then at the end of that study, when the mice are sacrificed and you dissect their brains, you see that there are regional differences in where the neurotransmitters are within their brain, solely as a result of this new microbiome being put into these mice. And so that satisfies that criteria A, so it does make it into the brain. And you can also look at genetic lines of mice. There are genetic lines of mice that have certain behavioral phenotypes, like one line that's naturally anxious, and there's another line of mice that's just naturally more exploratory. And if you transfer the microbiome between mice of these two different genetic lines, you make this naturally anxious mouse much more exploratory, and this naturally exploratory mouse much more anxious. So the transfer of the microbiome alone is sufficient for transferring behavior. And of course, humans are going to be more complicated than mice, but all of this indicates that, yes, this actually could be the result of mutualistic adaptation. And so what happens when we study, a lot of mental health research studies what happens when things go wrong. So what happens if we disrupt that communication along the gut-brain axis so that our microbes and our brain can actually send signals to each other? So again, the vagus nerve is commonly severed as a therapy for people who have stomach ulcers that are not receptive to other types of treatment. So it's not a first line of treatment, but a vagotomy will be performed if somebody's just sick for a really long time. And people who have this vagotomy end up developing IBD, or irritable bowel disease, much more frequently than people with sort of a similar health background who don't get a vagotomy. And then in mice, you can experimentally cause chronic colitis, or just chronic inflammation of the colon. And with that chronic inflammation, you see increases in anxiety behaviors in these mice. If you cut the vagus nerve, so you cut off that communication between the gut and the brain, those anxiety behaviors will never develop after colitis. So in some cases, you're preventing this bad thing from happening. You're preventing these anxiety behaviors after colitis, but you can also be increasing risk for bowel disease after severing that communication. So on this side, so the microbiome really does appear to be playing a role in mental health, specifically a mechanistic cognitive role in mental health. And we might really be interested in studying the microbiome of mentally well people, or people who are particularly optimistic or energetic. We might gain some insights there on how the microbiome might be influencing their mental well-being day to day that could be informative for other types of clinical care.
Okay, so then this is the final slide here. So just bring it back out to the reduction of the question. So that, obviously, whether the microbiome really has cognitive function is going to depend on a whole lot of science that hasn't been done, right? So what we were really doing, and Emily's was just describing, is suggested directions that look like this could be happening. So we can't say the microbiome does have cognitive function, but if things go the way they seem to be going, that's a very, very interesting result. But I would submit that we even at this stage of the science, we've come to understand something really profound about ourselves. Psychoanalysis, some of the later psychoanalysts, later early 20th century, did some very interesting speculations around the gut, right? In fact, I forget, Emily, do you remember the name of the guy again with F, an Italian psychoanalyst? Ferengi.
I don't.
Yeah, I don't. Anyway, he actually thought that the gut was doing processing. He actually made exactly the speculation, right? Which is a nice, interesting thing. It's got some intuitive character to it, but it just remains at that level. It's just a guess, right? You could also equally speculate the opposite and say, well, no, it doesn't, right? Which other people have done. Here we get by doing this mechanistic research, we actually understand exactly how this works, and that gives us the global understanding. So if you want to be a holist, be a reductionist first.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Emily. For those who just entered the room, we're going straight through all the presentations, and then we're having a big global Q&A. Okay, and I'm going to talk about Peirce's method of inquiry. So I'll start off by trying to convince you all why Peirce, why reasoning, why not some of all the other concepts we've been hearing about, and we'll hear about posthumanism, post-structuralism, knowledge and practice, practical knowledge, phronesis, as Miriam Bender just trying to sneak another logic of science into nursing. Do I want to cling to the debris of reason? And why focus on yet another dead white thinker? Well, my own goal is to try and get over the philosophical stalemate of nursing's art science paradox, which for some reason bugs the crap out of me. And I want to perhaps rewrite philosophy in a way that works for nursing. So, call me ridiculous, but that's what I want to do. It's quite a journey. Let's go. So Peirce was neither a realist nor an idealist. We need to say that right off the bat. I don't have time to go into all this, but pragmatism was Peirce's antidote to realism and idealism. I won't go into any of this, but basically over his 50+ years of philosophizing, he came up with entirely different definitions of things like experience and matter than what we traditionally think of. The big take-home message is that his pragmatism overcame the mind-matter dualism, which has lots of logical problems. And for Peirce, the traditional notions of reality, this chair is here right now, is just the wrong approach. And he never spoke about what is. He always spoke about what would be, what may be. And this is because he was always working out what happens, not what is. And here is Peirce talking about it. What is reality? That there is in the being of things something which corresponds to the process of reasoning. That is, the world lives as we just found out, and moves and has its being in a logic of events. So for Peirce, what happens is a process that can be elucidated, and the means for doing so is via signs. And what are signs? Well, there is no reasoning. This is his principle. There is no reasoning without signs. And as he says it in his own words, logic in its general sense, as I have shown, is another name for semiotic, the quasi-necessary or formal doctrine of signs. So I'm wondering, can you move that like over to the side, or to that side? Yeah. So for Peirce, what happens logically via reasoning through sign transformation or semiosis. What is semiosis, you ask? One slide. What happens logically via semiosis? I mean, we could talk for years about this, but I love this quote from Peirce. It's A presents B with the gift of C. And without that action of A, B would never acquire that possession. So what we have here is we don't have a relationship between A and B, you know, a static correlation. What we have is this quote general idea of giving. It's an activity, it's an action. It's a first. This is his technical language, first, seconds, and thirds. A first connecting with a second through mediation. Mediation, that's the gift. Third. Another way of putting it, growth by mediation of connections that emerge from chance. We're never here talking about static knowledge, but reasoning. And what is this reasoning for? Well, the goal is the summum bonum, as Peirce called it. Quote, the highest of all possible aims is to further concrete reasonableness. The world must be reasonable, all of it. No, that doesn't mean it's certain. That doesn't mean it's absolute. That doesn't mean it's true. It doesn't mean it's law-like. So why must the world be reasonable, right? Well, I think one reason I was drawn to Peirce is because he was a scientist. I'm a former biologist. And the thing was, this is what he observed. I mean, this guy measured the circumference of the earth with pendulums, you know what I mean? And he observed that variation and instability really was only the ever stable outcome of measurement. And he didn't explain that away. That was his genius. His genius was to admit this lovely phrase, by hacking the world was chancy. And he tried to work out the consequences of that. And this is some pretty hard work, because if you're going to decide that the world is chancy, right, it could easily and has been construed as arbitrary relativism, you know, and that's devastating in terms of accounting for the world intelligibly. And we have a big problem with that in nursing, you know, it's ineffable. I hate that, right? And I mean, my 12-hour shifts are not ineffability in action, you know what I'm saying? So Peirce said his task is working out how, rather than the world being arbitrary, that the world as chance could nevertheless be intelligible. And it was intelligible through a method of inquiry. So this is I'm a visual person. This is like my idea of Peirce's trajectory over time. It is my own. I take all the blame, although I have been greatly inspired by Apples from Pragmatism to Pragmatism. Basically this idea that there's 3 stages of Peirce. I mean, again, this is a representation and simplification, but there's early, middle, and late Peirce. So the early Peirce, anybody who knows the name Peirce knows this stuff, his logic of science. That's one of his pendulums right there. Science is the probable induction of the world. So spent his early part of his career working that out. Then he moves into what I'm calling middle Peirce. Again, I mean, it's not like he did one then the other, etc. In the realm of mathematics, which for him was pure hypothesis, free from the world, did a lot of thinking there, and then moved into what I'm calling late Peirce and aesthetic inquiry, which I'll talk about in a couple slides. So let's just first get past early Peirce. We all know this if we know Peirce: deduction, induction, abduction. He began his work in logic based on the Aristotelian syllogism logical structure, and one of numerous inventions and developments was basically advanced logic for the first time since Aristotle, right? And he developed a logic of relations. So, and that allowed him to, over time, instead of consider abduction, deduction, induction as 3 distinct methods of inquiry, that this idea, instead it was a sequential, a temporal, ordinal, i.e. Phased method of inquiry. So we first abduce, we generate new hypotheses, then we deduce, we work out the possible consequences of those hypotheses, and then we induce, we test whether or to what extent the consequences of those hypotheses accrue. Anybody who's been taught any kind of science is basically knows that that's what they're doing. But so brought that out, but came to a transition point. And this is why Peirce is so cool, because he always worked out the consequences and always came to these logical gaps and went further rather than stop. So the transition point, okay, great, hypotheses. How do you get a hypothesis? Where do they come from? Do they grow on trees? Is there a logic of discovery? Paste popper. Where does it come from, right? What does it mean to say that the world needs discovery rather than it's already there, ready and waiting for us? And this is an intriguing question. How or why can it be new? That's kind of a paradox. How on earth do you get the known from the unknown? How does that happen? So we move into middle Peirce, which is deeper into the continuum. Again, we're in the world of math, right? The land of hypotheses. This is like one slide and 2 quotes on something that he spent 50 years working on. Okay, so just saying. And I do want to be respectful to remind that this is all plausible argument for the desirability of a theory, as Moore likes to remind us. This is not worked out, and it's gestures. Peirce was great at gestures. Via Cantor's work, his own and others in the late 1800s, Peirce was able to work out that, quote, a continuum is a collection of so vast a multitude that in the whole universe of possibility, there is not room for them to retain their distinct identities, but they become welded into one another. Now, why is that important? It's important because the collection then is no longer discrete, but continuous, indiscrete. Why is that important for Peirce, the logician? It's really important because he now finally had his mathematical justification for his philosophical theory or philosophical logic of possibility, which now affords infinite rational inquiry, right? And it's the source. He now, came up with this is where hypotheses come from. They don't grow on trees, they come from the continuum. And it's in a way that's not circular. Okay, you don't need the discrete to account. You don't need the discrete to account for the discrete. Okay, so spent a lot of time in that space and place. But then, and this is again, this guy was thinking for over 55 years. How does the discrete emerge from the indiscrete? That's the next question, right? How does that happen? If infinite inquiry is possible, how does each instance happen? What's involved? Right. And at first, Peirce was really invested in this notion of instinct. But instinct, according to Peirce himself, is guessing, right? And guessing is not reasoning. He hand waved for a while. He said things like, quote, instinct and reasoning shade into one another by imperceptible gradations. But he didn't even buy that in the end. He needed to figure out how to transform guessing into reasoning process, full stop. How to make the logic of inquiry. This is no small gig here, a critical reconstruction of Kant's critique of pure reason. So then we get to late Peirce, breaking the boundaries. And again, Moore tells me that I need to say, we've been given not a theory, but no more than a very intriguing picture. Okay, so what we mean to say is that all this can be found in Peirce, but it's certainly not spelled out by him. So what is this picture? It's a picture of transformation. And the idea is how are signs formed from the unformed, qua the continuum? Literally, how do you achieve Aristotle's actual from potential? And he did it the opposite, whereas Aristotle had the actuals where the potential comes from, he completely reverses that and has the actuals where the potential is where the actual come from. And this is no small potatoes. He needs to demonstrate the reasonableness of what's not yet formed, of what does not yet exist. How is that even possible? Well, he works on where the loci of the transformation happens. And I have to admit, this word saltus is only mentioned twice in all the Peirce that I've read, but somehow I find it to be a talisman, some kind of key. A saltus is a term from logic. It's the unjustified step in a logical proof. And here is Peirce on it, quote, a sense of saltus, of there being two sides to that instant. A passing over from A to B by saltus. Wait, what? I thought that was by the gift of mediation. So what's happening here? It's at the continuum where your knowledge of the present as present. You've got A, you've got B, and somehow they're both there. Or more poetically, God, I loved it when I found this quote, which is only about a month ago. Everywhere in the world of life, there is an alternating motion, an inspiration and an expiration. That's kind of cool for nursing, huh? So the question is what's happening at this loci, the saltus, this precipitous, right? This precipice. How can A pass over to B without the gift of mediation? How does that happen? How does this leap in place of breaching continuity happen? What's involved? Literally, what constitutes the breathing of the universe? And then we get to the mode of transformation, which he never called it aesthetic inquiry. There, if you type in Peirce aesthetic inquiry, there's exactly 2 pages, 1.5 pages of Google Scholar results. So it's something that you can get from Peirce, but he didn't speak to it directly. What did he say? Quote, aesthetics and logic seem at first blush to belong to different universes, yet logic needs the help of aesthetics. Wow, could that be helpful to nursing? And Peirce already thought of this a long time ago. Aesthetics qua inquiry, apprehending that which, quote, reasonably recommends itself in itself, meaning that without the benefit of reference to anything else, here we go, no gift, yet which still somehow engrosses the attention of logic. So what do we have here? We have this apprehension of chance, feeling as chance felt, which constitutes for Peirce the very mode by which reason spreads the world. Quote, feelings awaken feelings, neighboring feelings become assimilated, ideas are apt to reproduce themselves. And so we can say something to the effect of aesthetic inquiry constitutes the work of bringing the new into the fold of interpretation, and therefore, quote, further the development of concrete reasonableness. So we could say something to the effect of, this is an idea of how science become, how the world lives, breathes, evolves, and is reasonable, all of it. So what? Well, I think this is really important because if nursing keenly understands that it happens amidst this dynamic, ever-changing context, i.e. a continuum, and it happens through knowledgeable practice, right? We're not doing an occult process of guessing rightly. We know that, right? But we have a lot of trouble saying what it is that we're doing. And a reconceived Peirce, I believe, provides philosophical resources for articulating an art of nursing that's not distinct from a science of nursing, but could become a cohesive logic of nursing. Peirce helped by he reconceptualized logic in a way that doesn't make it about rules for fixing the world. It's rather a dynamic relational method of inquiry, reasoning. And this can all be considered a rewriting of the entire logic of science that we can use to elucidate nursing. The idea of what's happening is bringing novelty, the new. What, do we not work in uncertainty? Is that not nursing, right? Instability, uncertainty, and that's what we do. We take that uncertainty and we bring that into the fold of interpretation or reasoning, maybe nursing. Last slide. Plausibility. This is something I've been recently working on. Barbara Carper's 1978 Patterns of Nursing Knowing. I've always loved this article, as frustrating as it's been. It's like germinal, it's got millions of ideas in there that are not worked out. Could we take what I've just been talking about and align aesthetic inquiry with what's in that paper in terms of aesthetic knowing, mobilizing the new into the fold of interpretation, qua what we normally consider empirical knowing, ethical knowing, and could not the cultivation of aesthetic inquiry be something that could be akin to what Carver calls personal knowing. And it's all in there if you read the paper. Sacrifice of form, infinite possibilities, a risk of total commitment. I love that. Movement towards growth. Isn't that what nursing is? Do we not place ourselves right there at the precipice? Right? Yes, to make health happen. And so we could consider the idea of reworking these distinct patterns of knowing into a method of inquiry whereby, quote, the world lives and nursing breathes in its possibilities with the goal of bringing forth health as a difference. Because isn't that what we do? We bring something new, we help to bring something new into the world. This is my case study, the decompensating patient that only the nurse knows is decompensating. No objective data, nobody else will buy it, right? So this helps explain that. That's what's happening when we're noticing the decompensating patient. How else are we doing this? We're reducing people's pain levels. We're helping families to understand what's going on in the situation where they didn't before. We get hospice on board. We get, people smiling instead of grimacing. I'm sorry, thinking of a out there. A modicum of peace, practice change, policy change. This is difference, taking the new and bringing it into the fold of interpretation. So that's why I have been studying Peirce for 4 years. Dead weight. All right, thank you. So I think what we want to do is maybe, do we want to sit or stand, or I've been sitting so long, I'm standing. And maybe could we also just make sure that that Emily and Clémence are spotlighted, but still see everybody else? Can they somehow be put at the very top? Well, they are there. There's Clémence, and there's Emily. And so now we've got time for questions. I don't know how much time we have for questions. Okay, we've got 25 minutes. That's great. I see a hand up on the virtual screen. Is it okay if we start there? Hi, Daniel. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. Hi. Yeah, this is, I think, clarificatory for Mark and Emily. Great talk. I'm sort of persuaded that the microbiome is essential for cognition, but that last slide about how that shows that you need reductionism for holism just went by a little fast for me. What's special about the microbiome relative to, I mean, if you already believed in extended cognition, so you're already looking at Anna's notebook, if you already believe that, you have the nervous system throughout the body. I mean, there are lots of functions that to understand all of them, it might make sense to break them down into parts. I just didn't quite get what was special about the microbiome, and it was giving us something new and exciting towards this thesis.
Well, I guess it's not special in the sense that it shows something that no other reductionist work shows. But I think it's because it links the mind and the body in an interesting way. It's a very vivid example of a larger thesis that, and actually in some way I take it to be kind of an argument by counterexample, because and this is something that should be developed in more detail, but a commitment that comes out of a certain kind of commitment to holism in nursing is exclusive of this kind of research, right? But here's the counterexample. Well, perhaps one among many. But yeah. In fact, I would agree that this is one among the indefinite number.
Okay, right. I think I was reading you as saying something stronger than you were. That makes perfect sense. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Anybody here in the room would like to ask the next question?
So I wanted to say this, and I guess this question is for both you, Miriam, and I didn't get Clémence. So both of you spotlighted dead white guys. And that made me laugh when you made that comment. But I guess I would invite both of you to share a bit about how nursing is evolving from that, in terms of how nursing is developing theory from this previous legacy and developing a new pathway forward. Could you share a bit about what you're doing maybe in your work, or what you're seeing in the landscape of theory development and even testing in the case of Clémence, from what you were arguing, that you see is kind of bringing nursing into a new era, so to speak.
No.
And then a follow-up on that, Clémence, can you talk a bit about theory testing? Because I feel like that's an area that's really missing in PhD education.
Clémence, you want to go first?
Yes. Theory testing and can take different form. And if I answer from Popper's position, it's just that you test your theory in terms of how it does approximate what the phenomena that you're trying to understand is, but you never get to it. And that to me is interesting in the sense that in nursing, we always say we cannot grasp a phenomena, it's always evolving. And what Miriam said in terms of we have to guess in the moment what we should do. And I think there is more to nursing than that. I think there is some regularities, some patterns that we have to understand, and that by testing the theory, and Popper is not specific in terms of what a test would be. And it's very often understood by people who read him that it has to be by quantification, but that's not what he says. And he kind of feels that we are trying to establish some types of correspondence between the phenomenon, even though we will never succeed in grasping it in its totality, then we're trying to approach it. So it could take different form. And for example, in the examples that I gave, which theory of symptom management will help us understand when there is a constellation of symptoms in an experience, an illness experience, what happens when one is added and one disappear? How do we go following and managing those symptoms when they appear, disappear, confounded one of the other, added to the presence of one? So how much those theories are helping us trying to figure out what is happening. So I don't have a very specific answer in terms of what testing would be. But it's yes, Mark.
Go ahead. I didn't interrupt you. I thought you were ending there. Sorry.
No, that's okay.
I was just going to add on to that. And I think something you didn't emphasize, but was implicit in what you said, is Popper thought that a crucial part of testing, what made it a test, was that it could show your theory was wrong. You're always looking, when you're testing, you're looking for ways in which your theory is wrong. And this is something I don't see in our experience in PhD education. You're encouraged to find middle range theories, but no one ever says, go find ways in which this theory might not work, and then decide whether that matters. And not all theories are wrong some places, and sometimes we don't care, and sometimes we do. But you first got to look for where they're wrong, and that's one of the things that doesn't happen in PhD.
And the other aspect of it in theory testing is that Popper doesn't believe that we can observe and look at a phenomena with nothing in our minds. And theory might be helpful to direct our gaze into one part of the phenomenon, and it could be wrong. It doesn't matter for him. We have to test that. And I think that we don't do that very often in nursing. And that's not helpful when we go into practice. And I was listening in the last 2 days, and to me, there is a difference between when I practice as a nurse and I have to individualize and to personalize and to act into a context, and the fact that I cannot have anything that is at the more general level to help me in that circumstances. And I think that if we were more rational in a way and more critical and more testing, we could include those different parts.
Thank you.
My answer to your first question is a political one. I also work in implementation science. And people like their abduction, deduction, induction. I'm like, you like your purse? Do you like your deduction?
Yeah.
Guess what else he came up with? Straight logical through line through that. So it's a political thing. It's like, okay, if you're gonna take this, then you also need to take this seriously. And so, instead of having, which we even do in nursing, we separate science from art, two epistemologies, two different ontologies. I mean, that's one way, squaring the circle. I'm sorry, a reduction to holism, but I'd like to keep together, as much as possible. So
Do that by reducing.
no, do that by method. So it's straight up a political answer. Do I use other, ideas and theories to help me make this case that I just made? Yeah, but yeah, I'm trying to conquer from within. Okay, so there are some hands up, and I'm sorry, I can't read the person's name because it's Coco. Coco, hi Coco, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Hello, not so much a question, but just a comment on the microbiome topic. I recently heard a podcast, and I put the information in the comments. It was an interview with a British psychologist who is also a registered dietitian, and how she combines her registered dietitian knowledge about the microbiome to treat and to counsel her patients, her clients. And so if you might be interested in that, because it's a really fascinating conversation about how she combines both avenues to guide the person and to inform her psychological interventions and her cares for her clients. So just a little recommendation there, and I put the information in the chat there.
Thank you. Emily, any comment on that?
Yeah, I'll just add, if you're interested in that field, the sort of jargon for it is nutritional psychiatry that's growing, and they do exactly what you just described. And then there's also the Food Mood Center in Australia, when they're studying specifically how nutritional interventions might be improving mental health via modulation of the microbiome.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, great. We have a couple more questions virtually. I just wanted to check the room if there was a question, like to ping back and forth. Counted to 7. Okay, yeah, you did it. 7.
This is like the art and the science. And I also love how you discuss the patterns of knowing, because for me, that's always been like the foundation of nursing. But then when I entered academia, it was like they wanted them separate. Yeah. And the art always looked at it being crazy. But I started asking students what makes nursing different than other disciplines. And it's that art. And kind of like, and I just want to know if you had any examples of how to do that. Because I found it kind of fun introducing that to students, but tying it into the nursing science.
Well, I'm trying to not talk about art or science anymore. I'm trying to talk about the logic of nursing.
Okay.
So that's the way I'm trying to think things through and to say, in simulations, you can debrief on that. Okay, what logics were we running right there? Where were we bringing the new? Where were the uncertainties, and how were we bringing those uncertainties into the fold of in order to make progress happen? I think that could be really helpful to students learning, instead of, okay, are you doing art or science now? Art, science, switch, toggle, switch.
Yes. But I mean, moving that to have them thinking about the possibilities. Thinking about, because I think that sometimes people look at art as just something nurses do for fun, but I think it helps us to understand the disease process. It helps us understand how families respond to disease processes too. And I think that it makes us sometimes think, you know, I can't say what's in my textbook and just put, you know, present nursing that way. How do I work with this family or whoever to help them to understand that? And I think that could go into, that's just my thing. I think it could go into nursing. I think it could go into research. So just something to consider.
Well, again, the method of it, it's putting us in the space of possibility. Right? And that's, I think you're absolutely right. This is where nursing lives, in the space of possibility. We don't close off, you know, before we even walk in the room. You know, we walk in the room and take a look, you know, and see what's going on. So I think we're very aligned. We're just maybe using different vocabulary at the moment. So we can just talk more. Why don't I go back to virtual and then to you?
Oh, sure.
Is it Anne?
Yep, thank you. So mine is more of a comment, I guess. And I do find the discussion on the microbiome very interesting and opens up for me a whole area of somatic knowing, which we're starting to see in the literature as well. How we come to know, not only associating not only knowing with and cognitive processes with the brain, but with mind. And so our understanding of mind, which can be much broader and much more inclusive. And there's many other traditions that have lots of, I think, really interesting philosophical and science, philosophy and science when they were not so separate. Anyway, there's lots to explore there, and I think it's a very exciting domain. So thank you for that. I guess I just wanted to pick up on this dead white male thinking sort of theme that was brought up. And I guess I'm just really surprised. I'm surprised and a little kind of disheartened that as a discipline, you know, people like Martha Rogers has been thinking about these things, you know, many years ago. People like Rosemary Peirce, her, I think, very, you know, human becoming, and it was brought up by Keith in this notion of becoming, this moving away from nailing down solidly, but seeing conceptual and theoretical. It's helpful, but it's not. It's always in a process of becoming, and so this. I think our philosophers in nursing have been thinking about this for years. So I think it just due respect to revisit something that, as you brought up Carper's, you know, going back, there's goal there that now the time is ripe to actually explore these ideas. And so to not give any nod of recognition to the incredible philosophical work done by people like Martha Rogers and Rosemary Peirce in particular, I think their time has come, and they were thinkers who were unfortunately for them, and we talked a little bit about this the other day about the politics of knowledge and how certain ways of thinking are politically shut down, which we heard with Bergenson. We have seen in nursing as well within our own discipline. So it was just, you know, a comment, and I do hope in the future that we do have some of our own philosophical theorists highlighted in the same way, maybe in compare and contrast, or even to critique and see where the weaknesses are, as was just mentioned, but to give them some space of recognition. But so thanks very much.
I know that Clémence, Sally, and I have been talking about that, how to you know go back through and rethink, re-understand. So point extremely well taken.
Yeah.
Did you have? Oh,
Yeah, I just have one quick comment. I have been so impressed with the discussions about caring throughout this conference. And when you brought up about the art of nursing, I think that's often equated in academia with what? Caring, right? The art of nursing is caring. But in your view of Peirce, how can that caring be blended into art and science? You know, how do you see that happen?
well, I thought I just said we did have to the argument, but it was only 15 minutes. I mean, it's like, again, I'm trying to get past art and science because it's divisive. I mean, we cherish the art and we cherish the science, right? And because they symbolize someone else's, right? They symbolize important elements of our identities as nurses and what we think we're doing as nurses. The trouble is you're never going to convince a chief executive officer, you know, to pay me to do my art. And this happened in California in the 80s. In California in the 80s, they decided we didn't need nurses and CNSs anymore. Guess why nurses finally re-entered the California? It was when the HMOs were coming out. People were dying, like the deaths were, you know, off the charts. Like there was no doubt that chief executive officer decisions to get rid of nursing were deadly. And yet we still can't, I'm at UCI Health. I still can't create a reasoned argument to my chief executive officer why we need more nurses. So I need for my own political purposes to get past this cherished notion of art to make, you know, the neoliberalist, to convince these people in their own language, come on. You need more nurses.
I do love everything you were saying. I just have to think about it a little longer.
Yeah, I know. Well, I was thinking about it for years. I'm still waiting.
We have to have that talk. We're gonna talk later.
Okay, Tracy?
Yeah, thank you. I have so appreciated hearing. I have a million things in my head right now. I'm just thinking about if we were to think about or conceptualize nursing as process science. And I haven't really worked out what that actually means because I still have some challenges with the word science, but hearing what folks have talked about today in terms of reconceptualizing that and processing those diverse forms of knowledge that help us to navigate, I think that paradox really of, and you mentioned it, the individual and the population, and the boundaries that we're practiced within, and yet the freedom that we exercise as nurses in terms of that decision making as really a creative place of possibility. And I think those forms of knowledge actually inform one another, and really I don't think we can distinguish them. So I appreciate that we're moving beyond kind of that sense of that needing to distinguish to get to a much richer and deeper understanding. And I appreciate that Popper and this historical way of thinking about science is exactly that. It gives us a way to think about and move beyond. So thank you all. I really am just really happy to hear the conversations.
Comments? Thank you,
Thank you.
Tracy. Thank you. Was there a question here now, Michelle? Oh, all right.
But very carefully spoken. I'm a complete novice, just entering, as a student. But so many things. I mean, I think this session kind of brought together everything for me. And is so upsetting as a person going back to work next week at the bedside in practice. A couple of things just stuck out to me from what you were talking about, the dead white philosophers, definitely, of who is asking us to choose between this definition of either or the and. Like what framework, sitting him like this, who is demanding that it be put in that way, even other than why wouldn't your way of it just being or becoming? When I go into a room, and I've had that experience of someone decompensating and nobody listening to me. So it becomes very practical that no, there is no RRT or there is no doctor's order. So it does, or the executive says no more nurses, but I don't experience it as an art or a science. And same with you, like I'm thinking, okay, yeah, there is this just, I'm a microbe and I'm a person, and I see the practicality of new modalities of ways of making me feel better. But I just guess as a newbie, who's asking us to make those dichotomies versus isness?
That's my new PhD. Excellent question. Mark, who's making us do this?
I would turn the question over. The way I see this work going, and so I think it's not that there's ways, I wouldn't see it as ways, I don't see it as ways of thinking that have been imposed on you, as if you've got a way of thinking already and then somebody read some philosophers but rather these questions, when I respond to these questions, I'm responding to literature written by and for nurses. That's where I take my philosophical questions to start from. So literature like Carper, for instance. So it's raising conceptual issues that are there. Now, that language very often is, and that way of thinking is expressing ideas that have been kicking around in the population, right? Influenced by lots of intellectual currents, science, literature, right? But very often we've inherited just as ways of thinking and talking, ways of thinking and talking that go back a couple of centuries. And they end up with rough edges and conflicts and tensions, and this tension around art and science, and even around the word art, right? Miriam and I talked about this a number of times. I mean, Carper's aesthetic brings together two different ideas of art. One is the kind of art that's on the wall, right? And many nurses have picked that up and gone with it. But it also means something else. It means something a lot more like Peirce's firstness, right? Which doesn't really have a whole lot to do with fine arts at all. But there's an overlap between those two concepts. And so then we get a conversation like Lucinda, I'm sorry, I'm bad with names, and Miriam were having, where I kind of felt like you guys were talking past each other a little bit, right? You're looking, as I heard you, thinking about fine arts and which is super interesting. But first is, that those concepts overlap like this. They overlap a bunch. There's also, and so you get these kinds of philosophical problems. Now, sometimes these problems have got a history that there's this very same conceptual conflict has shown up again and again in a lot of different places. And then it's not just dead white guys, it also has shown up in a lot of different other, right? You find it in Buddhist thought, you find it in Chinese thought, right? And so it's good to look to these places and say, well, other people who've been struggling with just this. But then here's where the fun of nursing philosophy comes in, is that there's usually a fairly large space. So if I go to Buddhism, for instance, to think about something about the relation of theory and practice, well, that came out of medieval Indian, North Indian thinking and a culture that's way alien to contemporary nursing. Is there a way I can translate what they're doing over there to what the real kind of conundrum that you're struggling with here? So it's not so much that these have been imposed on us and we have to struggle against them. You're actually struggling against yourself in a lot of ways. These are natural ways that feel natural thinking to me.
Right.
But I've run up against something here and I can't quite.
I hear what you're saying.
Puzzle piece.
Well, and I'm sorry, it is 10:30 and we have to go. I will end by saying, keep that question in your head at the whole time that you're being indoctrinated. Why
We're here.
why am I being told to think this way? Why am I reading this? Why are people teaching that? So thank you to the virtual audience. Thank you. 15-minute break and then 10:45 we're back.
Well.